Joining us today is the Honorable Dr. Nadia Schadlow.
Nadia Schadlow, the smartest woman in the world.
I've had the pleasure of working with Nadia on several projects.
My name is Daniel Durley, and I'm the president of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society. The Global Young Entrepreneur Society is an international organization supporting exceptional young people in accomplishing their entrepreneurial ambitions. Co-hosting the interview with me today is Louis Swire, the director of GYES's UK operations and the editor-in-chief of the Curious Times. Dr. Schadlow began her career at the Pentagon as the country director for Ukraine, a role in which she established the U.S. relationship with the newly formed Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Dr. Schadlow was the primary author of the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy, achieving the full endorsement across all Cabinet Secretaries.
You're right, I did work on this, but you were the primary author, and you did an amazing job. I was incredibly proud of that product. Not only the substance of it, but it was really important. We got it out quickly.
She delivered the National Security Strategy to Congress in the record-breaking time of just 9 months. Dr. Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She's a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Policy magazine. She is also a full member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Nadia Schadlow.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that lovely introduction, because it's really entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs who will drive the success of our free market democratic societies well into the future. So it's great to be here.
It's great to have you on. Today, you are considered one of the foremost experts on geopolitics and defense policy. What is your story?
Well, I think I'm not sure that premise is quite true, but only it's a topic that I have enjoyed and for many years and had a privilege to work on, sort of as a practitioner. So I've been very grateful for that and for learning from the many, many geopolitical and strategic experts out there. So my story, I think, is a bit of serendipity. I sort of entered this field through initially studying Russian. I always thought the Russian language was quite beautiful and it would be interesting to study. I enjoyed Russian literature. And through studying Russian, I sort of began to shift more toward U.S. foreign policy, understanding trying to understand the roots of the Cold War. I was sort of in last stages of my education. The Soviet Union still existed. So essentially, that basic foundation created opportunities for me to begin my career at the Defense Department. So again, a little bit of serendipity because you don't really go in, or I didn't go in thinking about a set of a career path necessarily, but opportunities presented themselves. And I found myself more and more interested in the topic of strategy. I would like to say that, sort of one point for this audience, especially because you're in a business environment. And so what I learned early on, what I became intrigued by was the element of competition inherent in strategy. And by working at the Defense Department, that gave me a particular outlook about competition. Unlike many other agencies in the U.S. government, whether it's the State Department or the Agency for International Development, those organizations don't really think competitively, right? That's not their process of thinking and formulating plans. Maybe some would push back and say I'm being unfair. But the Defense Department is inherently a competitive organization, right? It always is looking at what it has to do vis-a-vis adversaries, vis-a-vis rivals, how to protect American interests, how to ensure that you're building the right capabilities. So I learned from that experience that strategy is not static, that it's always changing. And so you have to be adaptable and always change too. And I think that is quite relevant to this audience and to your members. Essentially, the job I did really for most of my career involved supporting individuals working on all of these issues of strategic importance in the United States. So I worked for a foundation for many years, which, to use a venture capitalist kind of frame, we provided seed funding to a whole range of individuals and institutions that were working on really important issues. So we were sort of venture capitalists in the world of ideas. Our returns, our investment were not financial. Our returns were a bit more subjective, but it helped to grow the individuals who were looking at, the nature of China's political system, the nature of the Russian military, what should the U.S. Defense Department look like, what should the U.S. military look like, what are some of the most effective ways to provide development assistance, just to give you an example of the range of ideas that we supported, the organization that I worked for, the Smith Richardson Foundation. So that was important because that helped to establish a broader kind of geopolitical picture of what was happening in the world, which then prepared me for the opportunity to work on the 2017 National Security Strategy. I do like to say that I think the important word to use is architect, right? There were many people that contributed to the 2017 strategy. So I was more of an architect that pulled it together, ensured that there was coherence and consistency in its arguments.
What were the primary aspects of the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy?
Well, essentially, it challenged 4 key assumptions that had been out there before 2017. I mean, others had been talking about these assumptions, but the key aspect of the document was that it pulled it together, put it in one place, and said, here's kind of what we're thinking. The first was it challenged the idea that we were all nations were moving towards sort of democracy, that we were all on this path, an end of history sort of path toward political freedom, democracy, open economies. It challenged that and said that's not really the case, right? We have rivals who are thinking in different ways about the structure of the international order, and we needed to pay attention to that. It challenged or put forth the idea that technology is actually not being used all for good, right? That while there was a lot of hope in the post-Cold War democracies favoring individuals, people used terms like liberation technologies, that these were good for humanity, that actually we were seeing different kinds of techno-authoritarian systems emerging, which challenged the role of the individual and challenged democracies. It challenged the idea that globalization was an unmitigated good, meaning it said, hey, maybe globalization had some downsides. Maybe the United States was being taken advantage of in many ways. Our manufacturing had been hollowed out. It created vulnerabilities, which later became, quite apparent to everyone with COVID, but there were many people arguing that for many years. So we said, hey, we need to relook and look at how globalization is impacting the interests of the United States and our allies and partners. And finally, it also made the point that United States military, was contested. We were no longer the unipolar power in the international system. That China is undergoing, one of the largest military modernization efforts ever, and is continuing to grow. And our power is contested militarily all around the world, also by the proliferation of pretty potent technologies, right? Not just China, but we're seeing a system in which many countries can use commercially available drones and other technologies for asymmetric effects. So it sort of captured those ideas and more and said, hey, given these trends, we need to relook at the international system. We need to understand that there's a lot of competition in the system, and this geopolitical competition was something we needed to pay more attention to. Now, I'm not sure it was necessarily new, because I think many historians would say geopolitics really never left the international system. But politically, we needed to shift and recognize that geopolitical competition was front and center, once again.
What do you see as the greatest geopolitical risks and uncertainties today?
We're seeing those risks today. It's not even necessarily a future-oriented question. It's the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship. It's the evolution of the war, the tragic war in Ukraine today, and how that's upending, and it's a humanitarian tragedy. It's also forcing countries to think about an order that really failed to prevent that, right? Deterrence didn't work in that case. Main transitions we're facing, whether it's an energy transition, whether it's a transition to a multipolar world of several nuclear powers, as I alluded to, right? We were going from a world in which it was bipolar. We focused on deterrence and nuclear powers, U.S., Soviet Union, U.S., Russia, and now China is a big part of that equation as well as lesser nuclear powers too. So we're seeing a whole range of uncertainties, new technologies, AI, artificial intelligence are presenting us with challenges of speed, of the unknowns, and where there's speed, there's often instability, because there's always a disconnect between the pace at which government works and the pace at which technology works. So I think in thinking through the uncertainties, I like to think about the ones that are driven by technologies, the ones that are driven by the aspirations of nation states, and the ones perhaps driven by individuals. You can never discount the power of individual leaders too, to change things for good or for bad.
There's an awful lot of talk about China. Where does the US see India and its allegiances? Because I feel as if that's possibly an overlooked power.
It's very much an important question. I think partly it will be answered by what India decides for itself, right? So India has probably sent some mixed signals. It has clearly reaffirmed, I would in some ways say, its sort of traditional non-aligned role in many ways, right? Because of its sort of ambivalent stance vis-a-vis Russia. But India is obviously, it's a great entrepreneurial state. It's a country filled with technologists and vibrancy. So it's in terms of economically, it's a country that the United States wants to continue to work with. But ultimately, I think that's a question that needs to be posed to Indian leaders. To tell us what they're thinking. I mean, clearly they recognize the challenges posed by China, right? So in many ways, there are some clear alignments there. I think India has obviously been very important in the recalibration of the Indo-Pacific, this concept of cooperation across the Indo-Pacific region, and India is a central feature of that and understands the sort of the challenges of the techno-authoritarian state that China is, but its actions, its position vis-a-vis Russia has been more problematic. So that would be a great question that we should talk about in a roundtable with some Indian foreign policy experts. I mean, I think if I were a young entrepreneur today, I think it is important for you to have a thesis of how you think about that competition and how you think about into this blind. I don't think it should be dictated to you, but I do think you should be, fully aware of the range of positions on this. So, you really need to have your assumptions about the direction of China and where it's going and how it's likely to impact long-term, free markets and democracies, right? So you emerged, and Daniel and Lewis and others in this group, most of you emerged from a sort of an infrastructure, a democratic and free market entrepreneurial infrastructure. Is that infrastructure likely to prevail in a future in which China's approaches to technology and authoritarianism prevails? So you have to think about that. You have to think about the future courses of your business, right? Because that will impact a lot of your decisions. That will impact decisions about taking foreign capital. That will impact your decisions about where to put supply chains so that you can ensure that you're controlling them and not too vulnerable, to others. That will impact your decision about, what sectors to go into. I mean, do you want, for instance, to help in these contested areas, right? So lots of reports today discuss these contested areas, right? There's a great report. I mean, I'm part of the advisory council, but so I'm biased. But the Special Competitive Studies Project, which is SCSP, has done a couple of great studies. One is called Platforms, and it focuses on these platforms of competition. So do you want to work on areas related to AI, next generation networks, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing? Because these are areas where these are contested domains. And the report goes on to argue that China actually leads in certain areas like advanced batteries and commercial drones, and the US is probably leading in others, including quantum technologies, for instance. So I think this will help you make some decisions about the nature, the problems that you want your businesses to solve, right? And I think those problems and thinking about them will be linked to some of this geopolitical landscape that I've talked about. And there are different people who have different views on this, so you should read widely, and at least make sure you have your facts and figures and understand why you hold your assumptions and what they mean, not only for your business, but as I said, from the perspective of the political and economic infrastructure that grew you, essentially.
What factors will determine whether China overtakes the US as the world's greatest superpower? And what is the timeline for these developments?
Do you agree with the Biden administration's national security strategy, which articulates the view that the window is closing, that time matters here? So whether it's 5 years or 10 years, that you want developments to be moving in a progression which is good for US interests. So where, time is a key element here. A lot of factors will determine that. I mean, domestic US factors will determine that, right? Military, economic, social. Will we be able to be disciplined about our spending in this country so that our future is not really just spent paying off our national debt, right? Things like that, which right now are very, very contentious in the United States. Domestic considerations in China will matter too, right? China has many weaknesses as well, and thinking about the trajectory of those weaknesses, of its economic growth or slowed growth. The alignments of the rest of the world will matter too, right? We're seeing different alignments. It's not a bipolar world anymore. We have countries kind of, the phrase that's used, hedging their bets. So, will allies and partners and a whole range of other countries think generally the way that we're thinking and want the same types of progression? Are they hedging their bets? So I think there are a lot of factors. There's not one overall. Sometimes in strategy, I think the weakness sometimes of strategists in my world is a constant emphasis on prioritization. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, and people will say, oh, that's ridiculous, Nadia. But we've come to a point where we have to do many things at once, decently or decently well, right? We have to do many things at once, at the same time, simultaneously, to keep up. Whether it's domestically, we have to finally face the fact that America's public schools, for the most part, are failing so many people out there. We've not seen the progress that we need to see. We have to do that simultaneous to worrying about some of the bigger problems of, the future direction of our military and what it should be focused on, as well as what the underpinnings of economic growth are. All those things have to be done at the same time, probably by different people, but they have to be done at the same time. But I'm hopeful. I think it's important to think about the positive alignments, to think about the positive opportunities that are out there, and the opportunities that all of you as young entrepreneurs can bring to your countries.
You have gotten to know famous leaders like Henry Kissinger and Mike Pompeo, and you, of course, have been a leader yourself. What makes a great leader? So
I've been fortunate to work with many great leaders, and also to see some not great leaders in my career as well. Instead of naming specific leaders, I think what I'll do is think about what I think is important. Think about what has made some of the most successful leaders. First and most important is a collaborative leadership style. I think that's really important, and I think most successful leaders would agree with me. Not all. And what I mean by that, it's in contrast to a leadership style that is hiding information all the time and seeing sort of almost playing power games with information, right? I think today the way that you build a successful team is you build a successful team with collaborative leadership that makes it clear to the team what you're trying to achieve and that you're working as a team. And that's not always the case. It's definitely not always the case in business. So I recognize that, but I personally, my personal decision is to work with collaborative leaders because I think in the end, there's too much information out there to possibly sort through it. So the power of your team is going to help you sort through that information. Second, being clear in your objectives, clear in what you want to achieve, but also being open, not too stubborn to alternative views. So creating a process that really is a process to allow the injection of alternative bits of information. And that means that probably, you have to create an environment where people are willing and able to come to you with alternative sources of information, which is easier said than done. Because I've seen people react in certain ways to alternative views of information that do not foster sort of that environment that allows that. I think third, you need to recognize as a leader that there's a link between the operational and the strategic. And that's why information flow is important. There's a direct link to how things are actually unfolding on the ground. If you're manufacturing something or trying to create a supply chain for manufacturing and developing a strategic goal for your company. Just as in globalization, there's a link between the two, right? We saw how in globalization, the loss of manufacturing led to a loss of innovation. So if you're producing, obviously this is different for different sectors, but if you're producing things, letting your strategists sort of see what's happening on the ground, there's a link between strategy and implementation that's often not appreciated as much as it should. And finally, I think generally you want to work for a secure leader, someone who's secure and in their knowledge, not threatened by new ideas, not threatened by people that are smarter than him or her in certain areas, right? It's rare that a CEO of a company knows everything. And if they think they know everything, that's probably a problem. So you want to work ideally for people that are secure in their knowledge and really do welcome smart people working for them and with them side by side. So those are some of my lessons in leadership. And maybe I'd add a fifth, that a leader that just appreciates your kind of strategic and intellectual growth, right? So understands that you may not be with him or her forever, right? And that's good for you to go off to grad school, and they should be supportive of that. Or it's good for you to go off if you want to move in a direction to get your PhD in something. That doesn't mean the company necessarily has to support you, but the idea that you're fully supported in that mission, and that that leader is growing his or her network in a way that you've produced all these smart people now that are working perhaps in different sectors, but had their start with you. And so recognizing that in a boss, in a leader, is important.
You talk of collaborative, secure, and appreciative leaders. You worked underneath the Trump administration. Was Trump one of these leaders?
Lewis is in the job that I had to do working with General H.R. McMaster. He was definitely one of those leaders, and most of the cabinet secretaries that I worked with, day to day were, I didn't work with them day to day, but in the interactions I had, we fostered that type of environment on the National Security Council and worked hard to do that. And I think that that's why we were successful in getting the strategy done within that first year of the administration.
What impacts will rising energy costs have, and what opportunities does this present for entrepreneurs?
The biggest game changer will be fusion energy. There have been hugely important developments over the past few months on this. Timelines are uncertain, but they are not as long as most people have come to think. So there is a huge amount of scientific progress in that area, and that could be a huge game changer. But also it depends what kind of company you're in, right? So it depends. Energy costs are going to affect companies in all different ways. I mean, yes, the rise is inflationary for everyone. But the Curious Times, Lewis's publication, is going to be impacted in a different way than those manufacturing, microchips. So it depends your industry.
You talked about allocation of US troops around the world to ensure geopolitical security. Following Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan with US troops, what do you think of that?
I think overall, the way that we conducted the withdrawal was a disaster for U.S. prestige, and what has happened in Afghanistan is an unmitigated humanitarian catastrophe. So it's really hard to talk about human rights and the rights of women around the world, which are key themes of the Biden administration, and look at what's happened in Afghanistan. There's too great of an inconsistency there. We could have taken a decision which would have preserved around 5,000 troops there, 5,000 to 7,000, to have just essentially kept a status quo. Instead, now we're now looking for new places to operate in that region, right? To sort of in the ongoing fight against ISIS. So there are some inconsistencies there.
Where do you think the Center for Innovation will be in the coming years?
I'll talk about two things. So I think we need to be careful as Americans and the tech community from patting ourselves on the back all the time about being the most innovative country today and sort of having the foundations of innovation as our strength. Now, that has been true, but we need to recognize what has changed in that innovation ecosystem. Right. In the past, we often point to moonshots and the past successes we've had in developing everything, from microchips to the early moonshots to the moon. I personally think a lot of the foundations of that innovative infrastructure have shifted. Right. We can't replicate the moonshots of the past because too many of the foundational elements have shifted. The report that I mentioned, the SP report that I mentioned, the platforms panel talks about, they use this term, the geometry of innovation, the new geometry of innovation, and I like that very much. It argues that in the past, there were sort of three elements to that innovative ecosystem that America had: industry, academia, and government. Today, there are two more elements, making it five. Private capital, so you all are very important, as well as what they call the crowd, meaning kind of the broader community out there that are all important components to innovation. So I think there's still sort of a contest out there in the innovation domain. Partly it will depend in some ways on I guess, there's a book out there, I'll mention this at the end, Timon Chung has written a book called Innovate to Dominate. So we'll try to be able to innovate well enough to dominate, right? To change the infrastructure of innovation for us and for others down the line. I think those are open questions. But at the same time, precisely because they're open, that provides us and you all with an opportunity to participate in a way that's positive for U.S. And allied and partner interests.
That's a perfect segue to our final question. What books, media sources, or publications would you recommend for young entrepreneurs to better understand geopolitics?
I think, again, it's hard. There's a universe of wonderful books out there. So I like to divide my reading, into categories. So to my point earlier about thinking about where you are on this broader competition, whether it's US-China or whether it's techno-authoritarianism and, free and open markets and democracies. What are your assumptions? What are you thinking about in that domain? So some of the books that I think are good on this, but again, there are many. I mentioned Timon Chung's Innovate to Dominate. It talks about, the subtitle is The Rise of the Chinese Techno-Security State. That's an important book. Rush Doshi, who now serves in the Biden administration, wrote a book called The Long Game, which is an important one. Michael Auslin wrote a couple years ago a nice volume called Asia's New Geopolitics. And Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, because his thesis is that in challenging a rising China, we could end up with a war. And so understanding that is important, and thinking through that is important. Those are, specifically on China. On innovation, I've been reading. I'm reading now a book that is about 10 years old, but I hadn't read it before. It's called Walter Isaacson, The Innovators. And it's actually kind of interesting because you get a sense of the individuals behind innovation in the United States. And I think it's a contrast a little bit to some of the way China thinks about innovation and drives it. The well-known book, Chris Miller's book, Chip Wars, but it's a great book. There's a lesser-known book called America, Inc., which is about sort of the rise of America's kind of industrial policy and how we've grappled with that in the United States. On strategy, the books I'll mention now are books that are more in the realm of geopolitics. There's the whole business literature, but I'll leave that to you all to work on for your listeners. Colin Gray, Gray. I think he was at, I should know, I think he was at in the UK for a long time, King's College maybe. Wrote a book called Modern Strategy. I mean, he's a wonderful strategist, and anyone in that world will know him. He's written many, many books. I also like a book by a friend and old colleague, Thomas Mencken, called Net Assessment and Military Strategy, because the concept of net assessment is a really important one. It's essentially the idea that strategy is always changing. You often need to look at a wide range of inputs into strategy and develop your counter strategy. So strategy is rarely about knowing just one thing. You need to understand the wide range of inputs. So in your world, in the business world, it would be understanding your competitors, but also understanding what inputs your competitors are likely to have over the next few years, going forward. So there's always a dynamic quality to it. Wes Mitchell and Jakob Briegel, two good friends, wrote a great book called The Unquiet Frontier, which is explaining foreign influence in key regions of the world. So that's important too. There are so many books out there. My recommendation ultimately is to read, try to read 3 to 5 books on a topic of your choosing, the same topic. And that will provide you with a foundation of knowledge to think more sharply, to ask the next set of questions. And to read out of your literature, just as I now am reading more in the business literature domain to understand that world more, and thinking through concepts of strategic competition, thinking through classical concepts like the innovator's dilemma, all of these things that are in the kind of business community, and thinking about the strategy writing in the geopolitical world, right? That's the beauty of interdisciplinary, which is something that I love to try to challenge myself with.
We have come to the end of today's discussion, which I found incredibly insightful into the world of geopolitics. On behalf of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society, Dr. Nadia Schadlow, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure speaking with both of you. And again, I think the organization is great and will provide us all hope well into the future. So thank you so much.